Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next session of CME Palooza Spring. I am Scott Kober, one of the co-producers of CME Palooza, and I would like to welcome everyone to our 2 p.m. Eastern Time session. This session is called What is Data Visualization, or Data Viz, and How Can I Apply it? This session is sponsored by Platform Q. Our moderator for the session is going to be Ann Rock, and is the Senior Medical Director of Platform Q Health Education. And she said, if you call her The Rock, she will come and hunt you down. So I'd first like to thank the sponsors for CME Palooza Spring. Our gold sponsors, Genentech and Prova Education. Our silver sponsors, ASIM, Forefront Collaborative, Global Academy for Medical Education, and Platform Q Health Education. And finally, our bronze sponsors, ACHL, Clinical Care Options, CMEology, Helio Education Lab, Highmark CE, Impact Education, Integritas Communications, Connective, Primary Care Network, PVI, and RMEI. So as with all of our CME Palooza Spring, there are 3 ways to ask questions. It's great that people have been using all 3 of these ways today. So please keep the questions coming in. So you can use the Educational Measures text line to send in a question. The number is 267-666-0CME 0263. You can click on the Google slide link that is found on the live page. Please click on the Scott session so that I will get your questions. Or you can tweet your question using the CME Palooza hashtag. I'll put these back up periodically throughout this presentation, but all the information on this is also included on the live page. Finally, a brief speaker disclosure slide. Just keep in mind that the opinions, discussions, and conclusions expressed by our panelists are their own and do not represent an endorsement by or position of their employer, its parent company, or its affiliates. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ann to get us started.
Thank you, Scott. I'm honored to be here, and thank you to CME Palooza. I'm covering for my colleague Wendy Terrell, who sent in this session and coordinated the panel on data visualization, or Data Viz for short. So I hope I do right by her vision of this session. I'm joined by Dr. Bavel Shah, creative principal partner and co-founder of Infographic. Bavel holds a PhD in neuroscience and has accumulated nearly 14 years worth of experience in healthcare communications, including publications and medical education. She has a track record of combining science with design and is passionate about information design and data visualization. Also on the panel is Lauren Welch, VP of Outcomes and Accreditation at Med Learning Group, where she's been a critical member for over 3 years. Prior to joining the provider community, Lauren held various positions in public affairs and the U.S. Department of State for about 10 years. Her summary of experiences has given her an eagle eye to distill large quantities of text into more recognizable and useful pieces of information. And last, but certainly not least, is you, Scott, who has kindly agreed to cover for Julia Shklovskaya from Takeda, who unfortunately had a late scheduling conflict. And Scott will speak to data viz elements in outcomes reports to make it easier for supporters to share internally. So going back to the slides, during this hour, you'll learn general concepts, tools, and techniques of data visualization for your reports. Our esteemed colleagues are going to be sharing their perspectives from the creative, provider, and supporter point of views, and they'll also field some questions posed on the new social forum that CME Palooza is kind enough to test out, the Q board, where you had an opportunity to pose a question prior to this live event, or quietly stop and upvote the questions you'd like to see answered. So last I checked, we had about 6 questions entered and they were voted 40 times. So let's start with the basics of data viz. If you go back a slide, the what's and whys of it. Simply stated, data viz is the presentation of data in a visual context. Patterns, trends, and correlations that might go undetected in text-based data to be exposed and recognized easier. Like Bavel, I'm a neurofud, a brain geek, so here are 2 facts to consider. Next slide. Almost half of our brain is involved in visual processing, and we can get the gist of a visual scene in less than 1/10 of a second. That's important because daily human activities like driving and traffic depend on our ability to quickly perceive and react to events around us. The field of visual perception has roots in gerontology, where in the 1960s, James Buren, leading pioneer, noted that our visual processing speed is slowed as we age. So what does this have to do with data viz and outcomes reporting? Next slide, please. Well, reading a bunch of text is akin to slowing your reader's visual processing speed down to grandma's level. Outcomes reports are large Word docs that take a lot of time to go through. It's onerous for supporters or anyone really to review, to convey data quickly and concisely, and in a manner that's easily shareable in limited time and across multiple platforms. And so with that in mind, I hope I've sufficiently prepped your visual appetite for Bhavel's Data Viz 101. Bhavel?
Thanks, Anne. So yeah, today I will be talking to you about Data Viz 101, some simple tips and tricks to use data visualization techniques in your outcomes reports. So this next slide is a great slide from Wendy Terrell of Platform Q, who very graciously allowed us to use this slide. And I really like it because it does exactly, we do exactly what this slide says. We are putting our data in cells. And this next slide actually is a great example of just that. Basically, there is so much information here about Tom Brady, the quarterback, and I don't know what it's telling me. I don't have time to wade through it, but even if I had the time just looking at this, I'm not inclined to do that because there's nothing there that speaks to me in terms of what I'm supposed to hone in on. So this next slide is a really great example of how the author of this slide changed the information from the previous slide to something that uses really great but simple data viz techniques. So in this case, they've used charts to showcase certain percentages, large numbers to draw your eye, and then also colors to pull out specific trends and overall patterns that now you can see very easily and pick out what's important and understandable for you. And so my presentation really is about releasing your data from those cells, and that's what I hope to share with you. So there are so many ways that we can use to visualize data, of course. Charts being the main way in which we show numerical data, but there are many other ways that I want to also touch upon that will help you to use them in your data and your outcomes reports that are also separate to the actual numbers portion of your report. So let's start with logos specifically. Logos are a great way to aid recognition for key organizations. So for example, let's say you have a CME activity where you may have partnered with some key organizations and you want to highlight them. On your left, I have a quick example of a block of text explaining this. But on the right, you can see that the use of a logo immediately gets that recognition going, and then you can quickly see what's going on. So we had a whole lot more participants for CME Palooza versus this other new company, which we don't even recognize. The next thing that we can use very easily is maps. So for example, location data for your CME activities can be easily placed on a map, and that's a great easy way to show that kind of data. And instead of just listing it, you would use that map. And maps are really freely available online, both for PowerPoint and Word, so that shouldn't be something that's difficult to obtain. There are usually lots of free templates out there. The other great thing about using maps to highlight specific locations is that you are showing certain locations and sort of where you're honing in on. So for example, if you are in the stroke belt and you want to specifically showcase that you were having CME activities specifically in those regions where stroke is an issue, well, that would come out really easily in your map. The other thing about maps and showing something spatially in this way is that you would also highlight areas where you're not in, and that might be a strategy that you're using, or it would highlight the fact that you now need to expand your locations to areas where you didn't previously think were necessary. So the next line is about icons. And I personally like icons a lot because they really help very easily align your reader to a specific category. And that category could be anything. It could be your disease areas or specific program types. In this case, in my example on the right, I have used a couple of icons. The first one is to showcase symposium, so the live symposium setting. And then the other one on the far right is a simple icon for print. And so if your supporter is reviewing a report from you, very quickly wants to know exactly which tactics and which actual activities you used, well, that's a really easy way for them to quickly get hold of that information. Now, timelines are a really good way to see exactly how an activity played out over, a specific amount of time, and that's a great way to showcase information from a long and multi-part CME initiative. And also, if you want to specifically pull out time as associated items within your activity. For example, in this case, you might have decided to roll out each one of your activities in a staggered approach, one after the other, and then done your post-activity evaluation right at the end. And this shows that approach that you took very clearly. Now, schematics, and timeline is essentially a type of a schematic. I feel that some schematics in general are really underutilized in our communications and in our reports, but they're a great way to show a very complicated initiative, especially one that may be cross-comparing different audience types. For example, if you're looking at data across 3 different audiences in this case, to explain why you did that, that's an easy way to showcase that. And it's a great way, again, for your supporter to scan through and pick that kind of information up easily. And in this next slide, we show you a schematic that we used in the past. It's just a really simple use of shapes, just circles in this case, that expand out and showcase how when you educate, your one participant can actually see a specific number of patients on average per week, and what the total participation of your CME activities would equate to in terms of impact of patients reached. And it's a great way to show that sort of exponential reach that you can get and the great work that your CME activity has done to reach those patients. And so moving on to chart types, I'm going to just touch on a few chart types here, because I think that different chart types and how you might want to represent your data in charts requires a presentation entirely of its own. And so just a few different things to get your ideas going here. So proportion data can be shown very easily, of course, in pie charts. That's something we do all the time. But you can also consider other ways to use charts, as it were, to show proportions. Stickman data charts, for example, or stacked bars. Or how about circles that are superimposed on one another? And that's a great way to show that proportion and very easily capture how one is so different to the other data point. In terms of pies or donuts, I'm a big fan of donuts personally, because I think that they add an extra sort of area here to give you more space for additional information. Now, if you look at the pie chart, you can, of course, show the different audiences that you are reaching, for example. But in the donut example, you might want to pick out a specific data point specific to that audience information and place it right into the center of your donut. And that's why people use donuts, really, because of that additional space that it gives you. So, for example, in this case, we wanted to highlight the number of MDs specifically. So in the pie, we have primary care, we have specialists, but we also have PharmDs and NPs. And so by adding your primary care with your specialist, you can place that MD number directly inside, and that gives you that additional data point. Now, heat maps are a great way to pull up and highlight patterns, as we spoke about, as Anne mentioned in the start, about how data visualization really is about that sort of giving you an idea of a trend. And so a heat map does that really very effectively. In this case, you can see that your participants veered mainly to the strongly disagree section for question 1, but we're more likely going towards the agree and strongly agree sections for questions 3 and 4, and that you can just pick up very, very quickly by looking at it for a second. Now, bar charts don't have to be something we shun. If they're effective and if used correctly, can be the right kind of chart for your data. And that's what we're showing here really for our pre and post data. Now, pre and post data questions can often be very long. It's the questions we pose to our participants to see if we've got an understanding pre versus post versus pre. And if you see the chart on your left, you can see that that isn't a good chart to use because it's hard to place that label in a way that's easily readable. It's a simple fix. Just turn it horizontally. The bar chart is just as useful, and now you can read your question just that much more easily. I actually like bar charts a lot. I think they have their place in our reports simply because they make it easy for you to read that question that you're posing for your pre and post information. Now, you could also have gone one step further and turned these bars into circles, for example, and then you would have highlighted the differences even more, because a circle, relative sizes of circles next to each other can showcase that kind of difference, I believe, more easily than a simple bar as well. And so finally, let's talk a little bit about how to style your data. And I've put there, remember to style your data, because I feel that people often leave this to the last minute and sometimes don't give it the importance I believe it deserves. And I can hear some people say, well, that's putting style over substance, and that may be true, but I really feel that if you include a good amount of styling to your data, you will be reducing distraction, and you will be elevating your data in a way that people actually want to read it, and it will make people actually focus in on your data. And so there are a bunch of different ways in which we can style our data. Here I've focused on color as one of them, and an example for color use can be using the same colors that you have used within your CME activity. So for example, if you have certain artwork in that activity and you have an outcomes report that you want to share based on that activity, why not use that same color scheme? Then you're adding recognition for your activity. And if you're going to share it with your supporters, they will know what they supported and then the data that came from it in the nice cohesive piece. Other considerations for color use is, of course, who you're presenting to. So for example, if it's colorblind, if it's a presentation to a group of people who may have more color blindness in that audience, that's something to think about. And also if you're presenting in a room versus in a document, those are all considerations that you might want to take in. Secondly, labeling is something that we kind of over-label our charts and our graphs quite a bit. So we feel that we should add in every single number on an axis, and really you need to look at that and say, well, do you need every single number? Are you conveying what you want to convey with the minimum that you can get away with? And if you strip down your charts for labels and that kind of thing, you will avoid that clutter and give that attention to the data that you really want it to have. And finally, consistency. And consistency is an easy one. It makes your information look polished if you apply the same styles across everything that you do. And of course, it reduces distraction in doing so. And so the next slide shows some color considerations that you may have. It's a great slide because it shows you what normal vision can see versus what colorblind people might see instead. And it's a great tool, really, that you might want to keep and use for when you're designing some of your reports, not just for outcomes reports, really, but for other information as well. And so finally, I have like a really simple style slide makeover, and just wanted to run through a few ideas here with you. This is 3 CME activities across the year, and we're looking at participation data across the year every month for the 3 different activities. And of course, so we turned the cells. We released the data from the cells into a chart, simple line charts, to show the changes from one month to the next. So that's easy enough to do. And then we also used some icons on the right-hand side to show you the different activities, video, web, print, along the calendar year. But I don't want to stop there, because I feel that this slide can be made over further than just here. So let's start with the first item. I think that the icons that we have are very inconsistent. We've got a bunch of different colors going on. Some are illegible, really. I can't really tell what's going on in the video icon. So the first thing I would do is use art that is very consistent to each other so that all the icons are similar and look cohesive. The second thing I would do is use colors in the lines so that you have recognition for each different CME type activity that you have within this platform. Thirdly, I would remove those grid lines because they don't serve a purpose in this case, and you'll often find that Excel, for example, will default and add them in for you. Don't need them. And finally, the y-axis. So we have our labels that are at a diagonal, which is very hard to read, really. Diagonal labeling is always really hard to read, and we don't need the full word there. We can truncate it and clean it up. And so the final one looks a little different. It's just a little more polished. It looks easy to read, and you basically can see the trend in one quick view. And so finally, we have a really great slide compiled by Wendy Terrell of Platform Q, and she's put together a bunch of different data visualization blogs, if you're really keen on the subject, and also some tools and websites that might help you with your reports, and also some software if you're really into a more involved and complicated way of presenting your data. So with that, I'm done and hand it back to you, Anne.
Thanks, Pavel.
Well, we have a few questions that have come in while Pavel's been talking. So maybe before we transition over, if we can kind of, I'll get to a few of these questions. So for this question, this came in through the educational measures text line. So any recommendations where to look for free graphics outside of Microsoft Clip Art?
So absolutely. The resources slide that I just shared with you has a really great set of information. You can go to Flat Icon, which has some nice icons that you can use for your reports. And that's a great start. And also, there is PictoChart, which will help you, use certain styles of infographics, for example, within your reports as well.
Now, I knew this question was coming, and it came very quickly. Now, where can people get a copy of that slide you just showed with all those resources?
I'm happy to share that. I'm sure Wendy will be too. So we will send that to you, Scott, so that you can put that out onto your platform.
Okay. So this is a question that came over via Twitter. So now, have you ever seen an example of an actual grant proposal that used infographics, maybe, or used data visualization to sort of illustrate the steps in a proposed initiative?
Yeah. I personally have worked on certain grant proposals that have used data visualization to put together the concepts of what they're trying to do. So a great example there is the outcomes. They had a very sort of specific number of steps in which they were going to measure different points of information and outcomes, and we put that together into a really great schematic that was easy to understand.
Okay, and one last question that this also came through the educational measures text line. So how do you determine what is a good type of chart versus a bad type of chart? Essentially, you know, how do you make it? How do you decide whether this chart improves your data or actually makes it look worse?
So one way to, if you really want to highlight a change, for example, there are certain ways, certain types of charts that help you do that a little bit more. So for example, bar charts will of course show a change, but two circles in proportion to one another will showcase that change even more, especially if you have a very small percent, for example, versus a very large percent. That change, that difference is highlighted better, and I think it's a good way to show something that you want to really drive home if that's a change, a pre-post change, for example, that makes sense. A bad chart, I don't think that there are certain bad charts, for example, just if your data gets hidden in that chart. For example, in the example I showed you where it was just a bunch of lines, black and white, your data is absolutely hidden there. You might not be doing your data the service it needs. You're doing it a disservice, and it might just make sense to put some style in there so you're showcasing that data a little bit better.
Okay, yeah, because I know that in PowerPoint, when you're picking a chart type, there are, you know, 50 or 60 different kinds of charts that you can choose from. So it's just a matter of identifying which ones of those are going to be useful and which ones of those you can just throw away.
Exactly. One thing that, for example, in pre-post tests, I like to show the change. So if we're looking at a change and it's like a 20% point change, that 20% then becomes more important than the fact that you're going from 60 to 80%, for example. So you might want to consider those kinds of little nuances and look at percent changes and then compare those against each other. So a really great exercise is to slice and dice the data in a way that you can then highlight those trends a little better.
Okay, great. Well, that's all the questions we have from this part. So, so I'll give it back to you, Anne, to transition to our next section.
Sure. I actually was hoping Bobble can field one question from the Q board, and this was on the color schemes. Are there color schemes that work better or worse for visualizing data in outcomes reports?
I would suggest that you use as many contrasting colors as you can, because they will show up against each other best, of course. So for example, if you're using blue, orange is a wonderful contrasting color against blue. And this is something you can Google and figure out which is a contrasting color for any color that you might choose. As I mentioned in my presentation, a really easy way to help your data look great and match what you've already done, that activity that you've put together and put out there, is to use the same color that you used in your artwork for your CME activity. And that aids that recognition, pulls it all together, makes it into one big cohesive story. And I think it's great from a perspective that you've done all this work in your activity. Here's now the data from that same activity. So if it makes sense to use that same color scheme, why not? You might want to pull the most contrasting colors from that artwork, but that's another idea, another suggestion.
Okay, thank you. So next up is Lauren. Lauren, to start you off, here's a question from the Q board, and it's similar to the question that was posed from the audience on good versus bad chart. What differentiates, in your opinion, good data viz from bad data viz, and how do we avoid wasting time creating poor representations of data?
Sure. I think Bavel had a lot of great examples in her presentation of what makes for good data visualization. I think key things to focus on are as less words on a page as possible, using graphics wherever you can to display things, whether it's your outcomes or even just the upfront program description slides. You can do a lot. And as Bob will emphasize, while it does take time to stylize your data, it's well worth it with the time saved afterwards and being able to share it quickly and making the data much more available to a variety of audiences. So I can go ahead and start from the provider point of view, just to quickly go over what sort of challenges I think we all face when producing these reports that data visualization can really help us get over. You know, we all have an abundance of information to present, given that we use a wide variety of outcomes tools in all of our programs. We have a variety of audiences we're trying to reach with our outcomes, be it faculty who are going to then produce another educational event for us, or the supporter, or different systems that we need to enter the outcomes data into. And there's different expectations and different deadlines for all of that data. A lot of our programming, as we continually try to improve our CME, and as we get into new models such as the TELMS models, our programs may become more complex in design, and therefore we have complex data that, you know, we could really get caught up in the scientific phrasing, as opposed to thinking about how we can make that data accessible. And finally, you know, we all fall into habits. You know, we have our templates that we go to again and again for our outcomes reports, and it's a matter of thinking through continually try to improve upon our reporting habits. And data visualization can really help us overcome those challenges. Ways I think using infographics like Babel showed really helps us draw out the highlights of our programs. And when you can provide your data but include a summary slide or two that has infographic presentations of the key points, I think it helps all of your audiences, and it makes that outcome story more sticky because they have a visual in their head that they will remember, as opposed to slides and slides of words. And in that sense, it also makes your outcomes heard because they're more shareable when they're graphics on a couple slides, as opposed to very wide PowerPoints that not everyone has a chance to view. And I would point out that one particular outcome of data visualization that I think is really important for us to keep in mind as an industry is, you know, we're always trying to share the value of CME, and data visualization really helps us do that beyond your usual stakeholders even. And I have a little picture of the American Academy of Neurology conference. To the right of that, we've been very fortunate that this weekend we're using some of our infographic outcomes to display a large initiative we had in Alzheimer's disease at the American Academy of Neurology. So by using these kind of outcomes presentations, you actually get to stakeholders that you may not have ever imagined you'd be sharing your outcomes with at the beginning of a project. And I just have a couple examples here that get to what are key points of how you can use data visualizations in your outcomes reports. We put together a collective report on a variety of MS activities we had done in 2016. And it took me 4 slides, very lengthy bullet points to describe each activity, the variety of tools involved in each activity. And then in the next slide, you can see how working with infographic ed and developing more appealing slides, we were able to present all of that information in one slide without much text at all. And using each icon displays those different tools, be it 3D or posters, and different tools that the audience were provided to carry on the education and practice. That's all shown in those little icons rather than bullets and bullets with each activity. And then another example on the next slide is more to the outcome side of your report, where we're showing the pre-post data. And you know, even just saying one of those bullets, the percentage of participants answering case-based questions correctly increased by 17 percentage points from 60% in the pre-test to 77% in the post-test. Even that is a lot for someone to hear. And then you just have bullets and bullets of that when you want to do it by learning objective. But if you go to the next slide, you can see how you can really highlight that change by using infographics. Just those arrows make you fully understand that this was the baseline and the post-test, and the words highlight, as Baba was saying, the actual percentage change between those numbers. And if you have key data, you can even put that in another highlighted color to really draw your eye to it. So that's just some examples of the amount of time you save, both yourself and others, when you use this data visualization.
Okay, great. Well, there's a few more questions that have come in, and these are both for Bavel and Lauren. So maybe you can, maybe Lauren, I'll throw this first one out at you. So how do you determine when it's appropriate or when it makes sense to spend the time, energy, and potentially money on a data visualization versus just building basic bullet point slides that we all can do ourselves? Obviously, this kind of thing doesn't come naturally to a lot of people.
Definitely, and I think you can consider the scope of your programming and variety of audiences you have. But I would suggest, really looking at those resources that Wendy and Bavel provided, because there is a lot you can do, and you'd be surprised at how time-consuming you may expect it would be to what it is. And I would really stress that, it does go a long way. Even if you can develop templates, and once you have those templates, you can, work with them for a variety of outcomes reports, because you're always presenting things like pre-post data or program descriptions. So I would argue that it is definitely a time saver if you do it up front, and it's something that you can apply across your programming in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, I think that's an important point is when you can have some reproducibility for some of these charts or graphs or visuals that you can kind of use over and over. So once you do it once, you spent the time on it, so you can kind of use it again and again. So Bavel, this is another question that came in. I think this one actually came in over our Google Slides Q&A. So you showed a lot of examples of data viz to highlight quantitative data. How about its use in highlighting qualitative data? How can you sort of use it, in that sort of manner?
Sure. Yeah, qualitative data can be shown in a bunch of different ways too. One of them is word clouds, for example. You might also want to heat maps actually is a way to show qualitative data too. I mean, it can be assigned to categories of information just the same way as you would assign that sort of color scheme to certain qualities or certain, I should say, numerical data. The other item that you might want to use are diagrams, network diagrams. They're really great for qualitative data. So for example, if some format leads to another, or some decision especially leads to another decision, then those kinds of branched decisions and that kind of process of making that decision can easily be shown in a network diagram or a spider diagram, whatever you want to call it, and that can show that kind of quality of what one participant might be doing in terms of making decisions versus another participant. So there are a few there that you can use as well. Icons are a great way to show qualitative data. I know they're simple images, but you can categorize, again, responses, for example, into a certain specific category. And as soon as you start categorizing in your information, then your icons become important, because now you can align yourself with what you're saying in terms of the use of your icon. And then now you know how many responses, for example, were for a specific category just by looking at that number of responses within that icon section. So a few different ways.
Okay, well, those are the questions I have. Anne, are there any other questions that came in through the Q board that you want to talk to?
No, actually, one of the questions was about qualitative data and how to represent that visually, which Bawel had already fielded. So I would say next up is you, Scott.
Okay.
So as a segue to your section, here's the third most popular question in the Q board. In the context of data viz, what are some key elements that industry supporters look for in outcomes reports?
Okay, great. Well, so again, these are not my slides. These were developed by Julia from Takeda. So I spoke to her yesterday to kind of talk through what sorts of things she wants to highlight and what sorts of things from a supporter perspective she looks for and she values with data visualization in outcomes reports. So I think the first thing is that data visualization and graphics can't cover up poor data. It can't make a poor story into a good story. It can make a good story into a great story. But if you have 5 learners and you have no change in pre-post test and the numbers aren't there, trying to dress them up in fancy graphics isn't going to get the job done. So what she says is quality over quantity. So instead of kind of dumping a whole lot of numbers and a whole lot of charts and graphs in an outcomes report, figure out which ones really kind of tie back to learning objectives and make the most sense. So her 1-5-20 rule. So this is what I sort of call the book, chapter, sentence rule. So when you're putting together an outcomes report for supporters, really, try to highlight first. This is sort of your book page. So this kind of is the overall summary of the entire initiative. And you see here, this is a pretty simple slide. So this is from an initiative at Edinburgh. So Julie was kind enough to get their permission to share this. So this slide sort of shows the highlights of the impact of the overall education. So this is sort of, again, what I sort of call the book page. Then your next 5 slides are sort of the chapter page. So this is kind of looking at the 5 specific goals of an initiative and pulling out specific data points that talk to, supporting why those 5 goals were or were not met. One of the things that I know a lot of providers are often hesitant to do is to show data that doesn't necessarily show that their initiative was successful. But a lot of times, supporters are always going to be interested in figuring out, okay, what didn't work, or what did you learn from this? What data came forward from this that you can potentially use to plan future education? What did you potentially do that didn't come across as well as you may hoped? But again, kind of having this is a very goal-based, very simple, kind of presenting a few data points. And then her 20 rule. This is kind of getting down into the nitty-gritty, looking at what were the specific pre and post tests? What was the response on each one of those individual questions? So it gets to a lot of the individual detail if somebody is interested in going that deep. But really, what Julie wanted to emphasize was a lot of supporters will look at the 1, the book, they'll look at the 5, the chapter, and the 20 probably won't mean quite as much to them. And especially when it gets to sharing these reports internally and discussing them with shareholders. Your C-level, your C-suite folks aren't going to be sitting here and combing through a full outcomes report, no matter how pretty it looks. Your medical affairs, your medical directors may get to the 5 level or the chapter level, but they're probably not going to get much deeper than that either. So it's really important, especially if you're investing the time and energy into data visualization, to focus on the key slide, on those key slides, on those key graphs, on those key numbers, and not worrying about making the entire report look pretty, but really focusing on getting those first few slides and those first few images to have the most primary impact. And those were the things that she wanted to get across. So Anne, if you have other questions, other things you want to discuss, and I'll see what else has come in along the way.
Nothing. I just checked the Q board. No other questions have come in.
Okay.
So yep.
Okay. So Bawel, I know that this is commonly a question that comes in from folks. So where does somebody start who doesn't have experience with data visualization, doesn't have a lot of artistic skill? How do they kind of get their feet wet without making themselves look like an idiot?
I think that if you use PowerPoint to create graphics, that's a way to create better graphics than you might think is possible. Just simply using the sort of shapes and the shape tool and the text tool within PowerPoint, and you would be surprised at how much you can really get done with simple shapes, for example, in that. And you could use those same images in your Word document. So there's a tool right there that everybody uses, and most people have a certain amount of proficiency with it. So I think that you just need to learn to see what else is there available to you within PowerPoint and then use that. The other thing is Excel actually does provide you with some really great charts, and you just need to look at what they provide you and not just stick to what you've already been doing again and again just because it's easy or just because you throw it into a table and create a chart from there. Look at what Excel offers you. There's a great resource, the name, Stephanie, the name actually has evaded me, but there's a book that I can share afterwards with you who talks through all the different types of charts that are available through Excel and how you can also then change them a little bit to suit your needs so that you end up having some really good looking and effective charts that are different to your usual bar charts, for example, and that actually convey the data in a more important and efficient way. So I'll just remind myself of that name and let you know in a minute.
Okay, so for either Lauren or Anne, since you guys are both providers, any tips on how to work with either an internal or external graphic designer to help build these? You know, it has to be more than just saying, here's the data, figure it out. How do you kind of, you know, work best with people who, you know, are going to be creating these if it's not yourself, to make sure that they understand sort of, you know, the main points that you actually truly want to get across in your visuals?
I'm happy to chime in, and then Anne, if you have anything to add as well. I think one thing to think about is the variety of people you have in your organization, and people may have artistic skills that are unknown. So, for example, I've worked with some of the people in our business development section just because they're very artistically inclined, and they've helped me with producing a better way to show our outcomes. We've also worked with infographic ed a lot and have had a fantastic designs developed. And I think it's important that you don't just throw a PowerPoint at someone and say, please edit this. You need to highlight. At the end of the day, you still need to remember, as Julia had in her slides, what are the key things you want to be presented? What are the key takeaways? And work with the infographic producer to really highlight those key takeaways. It's a matter of thinking about what you want to present and prioritize. If, say, you were in a live meeting with the stakeholder and having that same conversation with the person producing the outcomes report.
Yeah, I would agree. With a scientific background, I hate to not show everything and to move towards cherry picking really the key highlights out of your outcomes. So when I work with graphic artists internally, I try to stick to about 3 to 5 key messages that we'd really like to bring across, and to think in mind, if I were to convert this outcomes report into an abstract that we would have to present to a conference like AAN coming up, how would that be done? And so to think of visual representations of that, to work with the graphic artist to try to make sure everything fits and make judicious use of the space so that you will get to your key 5, to be able to stick to your key 5 slides that the supporters will view.
So then when you are actually sort of presenting your data to a supporter, do you find it easier or more difficult to talk to data that is presented visually as opposed to on bullet points?
I personally find it much easier with the infographics. It helps me highlight the key points while I'm talking, as opposed to trying to prevent myself from just reading bullets of data. And we always go into the meeting with our backup slides. So if we are asked a specific question that we may not recall by looking at the infographic, we have it with us in our back pocket. But most of the time that does not happen, because most of the time infographics are showing the key points you're trying to present.
Okay, so this is one more question that came in through the educational measures text line. So any experience with anyone on the panel in taking a bullet and data heavy faculty slide deck and using some of the data visualization principles to improve their content? It's being met with silence. Bobble, do you have any Bobble, have you ever done that? Not done it? Do you think it would work, or would faculty just kind of balk on anyone touching their material?
I have done it, yes. We have changed up a bunch of different slides from a bunch of different faculty. We have always been and that's not done without their permission, of course. So that's the first thing. It's been explained to the faculty that there's a new approach that's being taken with their slides, and that this is the approach. There may be some examples shared to get them to understand what the new approach would be. And then we would change the slides with their full understanding, and then they would review them for content and ensure that we have not changed the content in any way and the specifics of the information being shared. And to be honest with you, it's always been very well received. There has never been any pushback. In fact, the faculty will then ask to use those slides again for other things that they may be present in other places where they may be presenting. So almost always we've had just a great response.
Terrific. Lauren and Anne, do you guys have any experience kind of, having graphic designers sort of rebuild faculty slide decks, either good or bad?
We have, I personally have not done it, but one similar point that I think would apply, it hasn't actually been our slide decks, but we often include tools for our participants to use post-program to continue the education. And while we're drawing from the faculty slides to produce those tools, we produce them in a much more infographic data visualization way. So say we have that Alzheimer's program, for example, we developed the Detect website, and that heavily uses infographics to display the key points that the faculty were making, and it helps to present the data not only for the physician audience, but also for the patient audience, and sort of simplify some of the more complex data. We've found that using infographics to do that makes it a lot more user-friendly. We also develop posters and provide a variety of images that participants can choose from to develop a poster for use in their practice. And again, using that data visualization mindset to design those poster images really helps make them more eye-appealing for both the healthcare practitioner who may be using the poster for recall, but also the patient in their office who they're trying to describe, say, the disease pathophysiology to.
All right. Well, terrific. Well, thank you to all of you guys for a really insightful presentation today. So for those folks who are watching this session and all of our CME Palooza sessions, we do have a quick survey to help us get a sense of who's watching CME Palooza Spring. And often we will take that data and turn it and use some data visualization processes to turn them into something visually appealing. Derek has very little artistic skill. I have even less artistic skill, and yet somehow we figure out a way. So whatever data we can have is going to make that better to kind of help us plan for the future. And finally, for those folks who are interested in viewing the next session, which will begin here at the top of the hour, once this session is over, you'll just need to refresh your browser, and the next session will be up momentarily. So with that, I would like to thank Anne and Bavel and Lauren for their participation and wish everyone a good afternoon.
Thank you very much.